have two presentations today from Dr Louise Parkes and Dr Jennifer Whelan. First up will be Louise Parkes, who is a senior consultant at Voice Project. Lou is the longest standing employee at Voice Project. She joined us, we're 15 years old, so she joined us back in 2004. We were a couple of years old at the time. We were still in academia. I was in a large academics office that we'd resorted to cope with 4 people within that room, and for the first, I don't know how long it was, Lou was part of that. Lou's background, she did a PhD in cross-cultural values, and then spent some time, around that time was working with DDI, and then has chosen to work with Voice Project, and I've had the privilege of Lou being a very senior member and kind of almost second in charge of Voice Project over those years. So thank you, Lou, for that. Lou will touch upon some of Voice Project's data and what that talks to about the level of differences and the causes of those differences across different demographic groups. So I will now welcome up Dr Louise Parkes.
Thank you. Thanks, Pete. Let me extend my welcome to you all as well, and also pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land in which we're meeting today. I am going to jump straight into this. Can I just say first, though, I'm not really an expert on diversity. I know there are many people in this room who have diversity in their titles who probably know a lot more about this and are working very hard at it. But what I'm hoping to bring to you this morning really is a decade's worth of research in terms of what our data says about diversity, its impact in organisations, and what we can do to support diversity in organisations. So I'm actually hoping, I know a lot of you have come to learn more about diversity, but really get some ideas. By all means, I think you'll get a lot out of our presentations, but can I encourage you to speak to each other about what you're doing in your organisations as well, because I know there is a wealth of experience and knowledge within this room. Okay, so in terms of Voice Project, as Pete said, there's 2 different ways that we really look at diversity through our surveys. So one is just simply by capturing the demographics of who's providing that feedback and looking at, is there a different perspective across the different demographics in a workplace? And so we do look at things like, do men and women experience the workplace differently? Are there different experiences for younger people, older people? We look at cultural and linguistic diversity, and we look at staff that have a disability in their experiences as well. So that's one way of looking at the impact of diversity within organisations, and we'll dive into that. And the other way, of course, is by measuring directly within the survey staff's perception of the kind of support that they feel there is for diversity within the workplace. So a diversity climate, if you like. And there's lots of different labels that have been given to this within our surveys and that people use, like inclusion, equity, respect, all of those kind of things. But at the heart of it, really what we've been measuring there are people's perceptions of whether there is equal opportunity in the workplace and whether things like sexual harassment and discrimination are being proactively prevented in the workplace. So let's have a look at the diversity demographics first. Now you'll see here, I'm actually not going to refer to one specific study this morning. There's a lot that we've done over the last decade that I will be drawing from in terms of the sources that I'm looking at. So this is data that we've collected with our client organisations, but also through the research that we've done through Macquarie University. So, and this spans tens of thousands of employees, thousands of organisations. So it's really is able to capture some of those demographics quite well. And I guess the persistent quest from the very beginning in terms of this research has been to ask the question, what drives employee engagement? And not just generally, but as you can see, all of these different studies have looked at, are those drivers different for different people? And we get asked a lot, how do we attract and retain older workers? How do we attract and retain women? How do we attract these different, diverse, other kind of minority groups? Because for a lot of our organisations, particularly thinking of things like aged care and disability services, who are facing really critical workforce shortages coming up, it is an issue of sustainability and competitiveness to be able to attract and retain a diverse workforce. So we've been looking at these things for quite some time. We haven't necessarily presented these findings in these breakfasts or in our other industry forums. Mostly we've been presenting them in academic forums. So every couple of years we have an org site conference that we present at, and we publish them in academic journals. So that's the kind of research that I'll be drawing on today. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Voice survey, it's an empirically derived tool that measures a wide range of different systems and practices within the workplace, and it looks at two key outcomes. So it looks at what we call passion, which is our measure of employee engagement, and progress, whether staff think their organisation is successful achieving its objectives and performing. So you can see two key outcomes there. Diversity, as you can see over on the left-hand side there, empirically sits within what we call the purpose system. So we know straight away that it is highly correlated with really the culture of an organisation, its ethics, the values of the organisation, its focus on results and so on. So we know that to start with. When we have a look at those key drivers across the organisation, so this is what we do for every client organisation that we work with, but again, this is what we've looked at across all of those research studies. And it has been very consistent in terms of the results of all of those studies. So our research across organisations, across industries, across sectors, across different demographic groups, consistently shows us that there are three key drivers of employee engagement. We call them the 3 Ps. So they are purpose, so that purpose system, participation, and actually that other key outcome, progress. And what that's saying is that really all of us are engaged when our organisations have a strong purpose and values that we can believe in and get behind. When we can participate in our organisations, we feel involved, we're growing, we're recognised, and when we're progressing, so both individually progressing in our careers, but we can see our organisations progressing. We're actually continually improving and achieving our objectives as an organisation. So whichever way we've split the data, across age, across gender, all of those are different areas, these key areas are the ones that consistently come out for all people across all different types of organisations. There have been 2 small differences though that do come up across the demographic groups, and I will talk about those in a moment. The other thing to note really is that diversity isn't one of those kind of top 5 or 6 practices in terms of support diversity across a whole organisation that impacts engagement. It really kind of sits in the middle in terms of its correlation with engagement and performance. But I'll come back to that also. So the other thing that we've found when we look at that data in terms of engagement, and you might find this surprising, but actually women and other minority groups tend to be more engaged than average across all of those organisations. So, for example, in a very large study, we looked at age, over 9,000 employees. We found a really strong correlation between age and engagement, and people over 50 were particularly highly engaged. When we look at gender, on average, women are about 5% more committed to the organisation, more satisfied with their jobs. When we look at people with English as a second language, come from a diverse cultural background, they pretty much consistently rate more positively and are more highly engaged in their organisations. And for that one, I've looked at our university data across 30 different universities, because universities are quite good at collecting diversity data, and that's in almost every case, people with English as a second language are more highly engaged. The other group that we've looked at are staff with a disability. And for them also, staff who are working in a supported business, a supported work environment, have extremely high engagement levels. And it's one of our delights actually at Voice to be reading through the comments from supported employees about what they like about their work. And I think it really shows how this group and other minority groups, I think, have a strong appreciation of how work does meet those common needs that we have for meaning, for recognition, for growth, for achievement. So you can see some of the quotes there in terms of that they like being able to do their jobs well, they like helping other people, they feel important, they're able to do something new and challenging. So we know that work can meet all those needs, but that's a big can. It's not always the case. And I think looking at our staff with a disability is a good case in point. So while in supported employment, we find these employees are highly engaged, if we look at mainstream employment, and again this is across our university group, staff with a disability actually were pretty consistently less engaged than average across that group. So here for me it seems to be that the level of support in the workplace makes a significant difference in terms of the engagement levels, particularly in this case of staff with a disability. And in fact, even when we looked at our supported businesses who are supporting people with a disability, yes, they had those same key drivers for engagement that we've seen across all staff, but diversity, support for diversity, actually emerged as a unique driver for them in terms of engagement, in addition to those other core drivers. Now, it wasn't just our staff with disabilities that we found this for. So in another study that we've looked at in a large organisation, diversity climate was actually 4 times more important for engaging LGBTI employees than it was for other staff. So on all the other drivers, they are identical, but for these particular groups, support for diversity was particularly important for maintaining their engagement in the workplace. So we need a work climate that supports diversity. How do we do that? So this is where we've actually looked at about 300 organisations that we've worked with over the last 5 or 6 years, and looked at what are those practices that really differentiate those organisations that are doing a great job at supporting diversity and those who have a really poor diversity climate. So what are the unique predictors of that? And there were 4 practices that came out as uniquely predictive of diversity climate in organisations. Some of these will be a surprise and some of them not at all. Let's have a look at each of them in turn. So firstly, just looking at safety. I think this harks back to the fact that probably a decade or so ago, a focus on diversity management really sprang out of a risk management framework. There were some very expensive lawsuits around sexual harassment and discrimination, and managing diversity really became a way of managing financial risk. So what we see here from a risk perspective, organisations that do a good job of protecting their staff from accidents and injuries, for example, also do a good job of protecting their staff from the psychological hazards of bullying and harassment. However, it's not just one way. And in another study that we looked at with one organisation who's been surveying with us for a while, they had some great longitudinal data. They wanted to look at their safety incidents and costs in particular, and what in the survey predicted those across a number of their sites. Disappointingly for us, it wasn't changes in safety culture, it wasn't improvements in facilities or processes, it wasn't employee engagement. But the two things that really stood out that predicted safety incidents and costs were support for diversity and wellness. And in fact, an improvement in diversity of just 3% reduced the likelihood of safety incidents by 6% and reduced their workers' costs claims by 12%. The second practice that we saw that strongly predicts diversity climate is having flexible work arrangements. That is very consistent with what we've seen in lots of other research, that to support older people in the workforce, to support women in the workforce, we need flexible work arrangements to manage needs. But here I think it also harks back to that second difference that we've found in the engagement drivers for women and minority groups, and that is around wellness. So in addition to those common drivers, wellness, that is having a manageable workload and not feeling too much stress at work, was important for engaging our older workers, was important separately for engaging women and our employees with a disability as well. And I think that helps us explain why flexibility is such an important practice to support diversity in the workplace. The third practice that supports diversity is around recruitment and selection. And again, obviously, this one was actually most strongly related to diversity climate. It's also one of the gap areas that we consistently find in many of our client organisations because it strongly impacts engagement overall and also performance of the organisation. And it's one of those areas that is very difficult to get right. And when we do get it wrong, it has such negative impacts and effects across an organisation and people in an organisation. And I won't talk too much about this because Jennifer's going to help us understand how bias works in this process. But I guess the bottom line is that we really want to get our managers moving away from using gut instincts to recruit and select staff, and to really get rigorous about using hard data, to be very clear about who they're recruiting and on what basis. So we're not using criteria that actually are irrelevant but would screen out a diverse workforce. I just wanted to share one example of what can happen when you do that. The person in the middle that you can see there is Richard. He was recruited and selected this year for one of our client organisations, Hammond Care, to work in their Park Hill Daycare Centre for looking after people who are frail and have dementia. He actually had quite a successful HR career, but wanted to change in direction. He went back to university and studied health. He went through their rigorous interview and selection procedure. He passed their physical tests, no problem. He actually works out a couple of times a week. He's very fit, he's not on any medications. But at 80 years old, he's actually older than many of the people that he looks after in that centre. He's been there for a number of months now and has been a fantastic fit for that particular organisation. The last practice that differentiates organisations who are great at supporting diversity from those who are poor at it is a really strong focus on driving results, both at the individual and the organisational level. And there are two kind of ways you can interpret this. One is purely that if you're really focused on results, you don't really care who's delivering them. So it kind of levels the playing field and gets people really focused on measuring hard data and achieving results. The second way is really to look at, I guess, some of the track record of some big organisations who've been working hard at measuring diversity results. So actually setting goals and targets around diversity, having some clear strategies and being able to measure success, and that whole what you measure and what you manage kind of philosophy goes through here. I'll talk very quickly about this, but I think one of the areas that has come out and illustrates this, I think, in our data is when we look across sectors. So in those 300 organisations that I mentioned, I just threw this into the mix to have a look at how they performed, not expecting any particular differences. Actually, the public sector organisations that we worked with had a significantly lower ratings around their diversity climate than private and not-for-profit sector. And a couple of years ago, we actually worked with the New South Wales public sector on their staff survey, but also on a survey of their agencies in terms of the maturity of the HR practices across the sector. They're well aware that they have this kind of profile for women in leadership across the organisation, where you can see the disparity at the higher levels of leadership where we have a much lower proportion of women. Despite the fact that they're aware of that, when we asked the agencies, less than 10% of them actually had a policy to address gender imbalance, had actually set any goals or KPIs, or considered gender in succession planning. So really, we can see here, I think, how having targets and actually working towards them can make a difference. So let me finish up. In summary, I think increasing the diversity of the workforce has the potential to lift the performance of our organisations. But it's really improving the diversity climate that engages staff and releases those diversity benefits in an organisation. And from our data, really to support diversity, I know there are many things that we could do, but a great place to start is to work on safety initiatives, to make sure you are providing flexible work arrangements, to set diversity goals and measure them, and broaden recruitment and make it easier to select objectively.